The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. The fields of Normandy had turned into rivers of mud and blood, where every step sucked the soul from a soldier's boots. The air smelled of smoke, cordite, and fear. Somewhere between the chaos of machine gun fire and the endless roar of artillery, a woman in a torn medic's uniform was running. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. To most, she was Doc Ellie. To the wounded men she saved, she was hope itself. "Get down, Ellie! You'll get yourself killed!" someone shouted as she sprinted across the field. But she didn't slow down. A squad of men was trapped near a blown-out Sherman tank, and she could still hear one of them screaming. The shells fell closer. The world became sound and fury. Metal splitting air, earth bursting apart. She dove behind the wrecked tank, her breath ragged, her hands trembling. But even through the fear, she crawled forward, dragging a medic bag heavy with bandages and morphine. She found a soldier, his legs shredded, eyes wide in terror. "Stay with me, soldier. I've got you," she said, voice steady. The man gripped her wrist, whispering through clenched teeth. "You're not supposed to be here." Ellie smiled faintly. "Neither are you." And then the next shell hit, closer, shaking the ground. She threw herself over the soldier, shielding him with her own body as the explosion tore through the mud. When the smoke cleared, her back was bleeding from shrapnel. But she was still alive, and so was he. By nightfall, the word had spread across the camp. The Angel of Normandy had saved 6 men under fire. But Ellie didn't hear it. She was in the makeshift tent hospital, stitching a man's arm under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Her hands were steady, her face pale but unbroken. Colonel Travis entered quietly, his boots leaving muddy prints. He watched her work, precise, fearless. "How many today?" he asked. She didn't look up. 9. 2 didn't make it." The colonel nodded slowly. "You shouldn't even be here, Lieutenant. You're supposed to be behind the lines." Ellie finally looked up, eyes fierce. "Sir, the lines keep moving. My place is where they bleed." He had no answer for that. He just stood there for a moment, then did something no one expected. He saluted her. The snow fell in thick silence over the Ardennes forest. It was December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. The sky was gray and heavy, the trees bending under the weight of ice and death. Eleanor Hayes was now with the 101st Airborne, surrounded, freezing, and out of supplies in the town of Bastogne. The men had been fighting for days without rest. Food was scarce, ammunition even scarcer. And through all of it, Ellie never stopped moving. She worked inside a half-destroyed chapel that had been turned into a field hospital. The stained glass windows were shattered, the altar covered in blood and bandages. Every few minutes, the rumble of German artillery shook the walls. She was running out of morphine and time. "Doc, we got more coming in," a paratrooper yelled, dragging 2 frostbitten men through the door. Ellie's breath showed in white puffs as she knelt beside them. Their faces were gray, lips blue. She took off her gloves, her fingers raw and trembling, and began to work. "Don't close your eyes, soldier," she whispered. "Not tonight." She tore her own scarf, pressing it against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Her movements were mechanical, instinctive, the rhythm of a soul who had seen too much and still refused to give up. Outside, the enemy fire drew closer. The ground quaked. Someone shouted, "They're breaking through the east wall!" Ellie didn't even flinch. Instead, she stood up, wiped the blood from her hands, and walked toward the door. She stepped outside where the snowflakes melting on her face. A German mortar shell hit a nearby house, scattering flaming debris. In the chaos, she saw them. A group of American soldiers trapped behind a collapsed truck, one of them crying for help. Without thinking, Ellie grabbed a Red Cross armband and sprinted across the open street. Bullets cracked past her, snapping the air like whips. "Ellie, no!" someone shouted. But she kept running. She reached the men, sliding behind the wreck. One soldier was bleeding from his chest, another unconscious. She dragged one by his collar, then the next, teeth clenched, boots slipping in blood and ice. A sniper bullet tore through her sleeve, grazing her arm, but she didn't stop. She just gritted her teeth, whispering, "Not today." When she finally pulled the last man to safety, her hands were numb, her uniform soaked in blood. And that's when she heard it, a low rumble in the distance. The sound of American tanks. Reinforcements had arrived. Bastogne was saved. When it was all over, General McAuliffe himself came to the field hospital. He had heard what she did, how she crossed enemy fire to pull men out. He found her sitting by a soldier's bed, bandaging his arm with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, straightened his cap, and saluted her. Every man in the tent followed. One by one, dirty, broken, bleeding, they all rose to their feet and saluted the woman who had refused to leave them behind. For a moment there was no sound, but the wind howling through the broken glass. And in that silence, Eleanor Hayes looked around, tears in her eyes, and finally allowed herself to breathe. She was no longer just Doc Ellie. She was a legend. The Angel of Normandy, the woman the general saluted. When the war finally ended, Europe was silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence after too much death. Fields that once roared with tanks were now filled with crosses. Cities that once glowed with fire now lay in smoke and dust. Eleanor Hayes stood among the ruins of a village in France, her hands trembling as she tied a small white cloth to a wooden cross. The name on it was barely readable, one of her men from Bastogne. She brushed the dirt away gently, her eyes red and distant. She had survived, but a part of her had been buried on every battlefield she walked through. A jeep pulled up behind her. A young officer stepped out, crisp uniform, clean boots, untouched by war. "Ma'am," he said softly, "General McAuliffe sent this for you." He handed her a small box. Inside was a silver star and a note in the general's own handwriting. It said only 5 words. For courage beyond all measure. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, clutching the medal close to her heart. When she returned to America, the streets were alive with celebration. Flags waving, parades everywhere. But she felt like a ghost walking through the cheers. No one knew her name. No one knew how many she had saved. She took a small job at a veterans hospital in New York, working long hours in the trauma ward. Sometimes soldiers recognized her. "Hey, weren't you in Bastogne?" But she always smiled and said, "I was just doing my part." At night, she would sit by the window of her small apartment, the city lights flickering below, and read the letters from the men she saved. Some were smudged with dirt and blood. Others were from their families, thanking her for bringing their sons home. It was enough. Years passed. The world moved on. Wars came and went, and heroes faded into history books. Then, in 1978, more than 30 years later, a military historian writing about the Battle of Bastogne came across a name that appeared again and again in soldiers' letters. Eleanor Hayes, the medic who never left us. He tracked her down to a small retirement home outside Boston. When he met her, she was sitting in the garden, feeding a stray cat, her hair silver, her hands still steady. "Ma'am," he said, "the men you saved, they called you the Angel of Normandy." She laughed softly. "I was no angel, son. I was just there when they needed someone." But the historian wasn't done. A month later, her story appeared on national television, a segment on Forgotten Heroes of World War II. When it aired, something extraordinary happened. Letters poured in from all over the country, from soldiers, families, even generals. All of them writing to say one thing: "We remember." The day after the broadcast, the U.S. Army held a ceremony in her honor. Veterans lined the hall in full uniform. At the center, an aged General McAuliffe, now white-haired, moving slowly with a cane, stood and saluted her again. The same way he had done in Bastogne all those years ago. As the room filled with applause, Eleanor's eyes glistened. Not from pride, but from peace, knowing the men she saved were remembered at last. She closed her eyes, and for a brief moment, she was back there, snow falling, the sound of distant shells, the faces of the boys she refused to let die. History would call her a nurse. But the men who fought beside her, they called her something else. The Angel of Normandy,